So here to do the Q&A for Neuromod Devices, and if you'd like to introduce yourself, Ross.
Yeah, so my name is Ross O'Neill. I'm the founding CEO of the company. So we started it, I guess, back in 2010 as a spin-out of an Irish university to commercialise some research that we had worked on in that university.
Yeah. First thing, looking at a little bit of history on the device. So you obviously came to market around about 2015, and then you backed away from the market. So what kind of happened there, and why did you back away?
Yeah, so in 2015 we had completed the TAV study, which was a 60-patient trial to demonstrate the kind of initial safety and efficacy of the device, and that got us our CE mark, which allowed us to market the device in Europe. So we did, based on the results of the TAV study and the CE mark, we opened a clinic here in Dublin. It was open for 1 day a week for 1 quarter, and in that time we sold over 100 devices. But at the same time, we were raising a venture capital investment to pursue FDA approval. Part of that process involves, conducting very large-scale clinical trials.
Yeah.
So we're a small organisation. We've got limited resources. So we decided at that time to focus those resources on completing those clinical trials, and we paused commercial sales at that time. So we paused commercial activity here in Dublin, and we didn't open any other clinics across Europe at the time.
What have you learnt from that time period up until now?
So we've done 2 major trials. So we've done TENT-A 1, which is now completed, and the patients have completed treatment and also 12-month follow-up. That was a 326-patient trial across 2 sites here in Dublin and also Regensburg in Germany. Berthold Languth, who a lot of people will know, he's the kind of founder of the Tinnitus Research Initiative. He was the PI over there. He's also on our science advisory board. And Mr. Brendan Conlon, who's a leading ENT here in Ireland, he was the PI on the Dublin site. So we completed that trial, and that was a parameter optimization and patient subtyping study.
Yeah.
So that was about looking at a number of different stimulation settings on the device, and looking at the effects of those settings, both in the wider tinnitus population, but equally in patient subtypes. So this idea of patient subtyping is something that's emerging from the work of the TRI. As you know, they have working groups on this. And there are definite groups starting to emerge. There's like hyperacoustic tinnitus patients, there's somatic tinnitus patients. So we wanted to see if any of these groups differentially responded to any particular set of parameters. So it's very much in line with the most cutting edge research that's being published right now.
Yeah. So effectively, originally you started with tinnitus, and then you've moved on looking at the subtypes and just looking how it affects different people with.
Yeah, so our approach was this high frequency synchronous stimulation, right? So our approach is that we simultaneously stimulate the auditory using sound and the trigeminal nerve via the tongue. And our approach was to use this high frequency synchronized stimulation, but there's a lot of literature emerging that different parameters might drive different effects in different subgroups. So what TENT-A 1 has shown us is that high frequency synchronous stimulation, which was always our approach, it remains effective in the majority of the overall tinnitus population. But it also has identified a number of kind of highly responsive subtypes, one of which are these hyperacoustic patients. So these are patients that have both tinnitus and hyperacusis. So the response rates that we're seeing in that group are much higher. The levels of response are much greater. So what we've learned from this study is we've learned to prescribe the device more effectively. So we target it, and also we've also had some learnings around stimulation settings that we can drive further benefit than we were before.
just sort of segueing a little bit into hyperacusis. So was that something you were actually expecting, or is this something that just kind of jumped out from the study?
No, so we in line with best clinical practices, and this was kind of, you'll see that the involvement of another member on our science advisory board, who's Professor Deborah Hall, who's been one of the most vociferous proponents of clinical rigor in clinical trials in tinnitus. So one of the things you do is you pre-publish your protocols, your clinical protocols, before you do the study. So we published the protocol of the 10-day-1 study in the British Medical Journal, and that's freely available on our website, and is also open access on the BMJ website. And one of the groups that we kind of pre-specified that we would look at were these hyperacoustic patients. So we looked at those, looked at a number of other groups, but these guys really emerged very strongly as being highly responsive to this high frequency synchronous bimodal stimulation.
So did you find equally it helped the hyperacusis and the tinnitus, or was there a bigger effect on the hyperacusis?
No, so and that is a very important point, is that these are tinnitus patients who have a concomitant hyperacusis, but what the data is saying to us is it's not a treatment for their hyperacusis. So we defined hyperacusis as sound sensitivity to loudness discomfort levels of 60 dB SL or less. And we when we looked at the LDL scores before and after, they hadn't statistically changed, but their tinnitus scores changed dramatically. Now, when we did another piece of rigorous study, was that we kind of looked at did we just get lucky with that definition of hyperacusis? So when we correlated all the patients in arm 1 of the study, and we correlated their level of sound sensitivity to the amount of improvement that they got, there was a very, very strong correlation between the two. So we know there's something special going on with these patients.
So did you distinguish between pain hyperacusis and sound tolerance hyperacusis, or potentially the 6 definitions of hyperacusis? Was it just hyperacusis as the complaint?
Our definition of it was patients who reported sensitivity to sounds of 60 dB SL or less. So we didn't distinguish. But now that these guys have emerged, obviously we are going to investigate that further and try to understand it a lot more.
Safety profile again for hyperacusis, of course, we're talking about patients who do not want noise. How do you manage that? Is it the device settings, is just the volumes at quite a low level? Do you manage the tone so that it doesn't irritate the hyperacusis?
So the device is configured for your hearing levels, so to guarantee a minimum level of stimulation in your lowest hearing band, or your least effective hearing band. Now they got the same kind of configuration as everybody else. What we did see was that the compliance levels in the study generally were very, very high. So they were about 83+%. Now they were equally high in that hyperacusis group. So as you say, these patients are normally kind of averse to sound stimulation. So the fact that they are so compliant to treatment is telling us that they are definitely perceiving the benefit. Because if they weren't, given that they're so averse to the sound component of the treatment, they wouldn't be so compliant.
Can you give us an explanation of exactly how the device works? Maybe start with, is it calibrated to the individual?
Yeah, so it's calibrated to the individual in that it's tuned to their hearing profile, not necessarily their tinnitus. So we want to ensure that we get a minimum level of stimulation at their kind of lowest hearing level in whatever frequency that is. So it requires an audiogram, so they would have to see their audiologist to get that, and then that is used to kind of personalize the treatment for them. How the device works, it pairs proprietary sound, which is a combination of both tones and some noise. But the tones are paired with trigeminal nerve stimulation via the tongue. So how we do that is with this small electrode, this intraoral electrode called the tongue tip.
Yeah.
So it's a lot like a lollipop.
Yeah.
So the patient puts that on their tongue. It has 32 electrodes on it, 16 each side, and basically the tones that they get, that they hear through the headphones, are then paired with pulses on the tongue. It's very mild electrical stimulation. People ask what it feels like, and it's I describe it a bit like those pop rocks that, you know, pop rock and candy, but
Yes.
but it's not as strong as that, or that can be quite a vigorous kind of experience. This is much milder. And basically it pairs those two stimuli together, and you undergo 30 to 60 minutes of that treatment every day for a minimum of 10 weeks. So in the most recent study, patients underwent 12 weeks of treatment. So that's basically how the device works.
What about calibration? Do you have to bring people in to recalibrate the device? I know we've looked at other audio treatments where there might need to be some calibration.
No, so unless their hearing profile changes, which it tends to not change dramatically over the course of 12 weeks, unless you've been exposed to loud noise or something, then it doesn't require any additional calibration, no.
So again, because you're not matching to the tinnitus tone, you're matching a particular sound, like say proprietary sound, it doesn't actually have that same issue with calibration.
No, I've heard of other therapies where you have to tinnitus match, and then you kind of set notch filters or something like that based on the tinnitus tone. Our device is personalized to the hearing profile and not the actual tinnitus.
In terms of using the devices, there'll be a fitting, there'll be a calibration, and then the person takes it away and uses it at home?
Yeah, so they take it, they use it in the comfort and privacy of their own home for 30 to 60 minutes per day. Again, we have involved patients, doctors, ENT doctors, audiologists from the very start while we were designing this technology, and we've kind of listened to their input, and we tried to satisfy the kind of needs of all. And one of the things the patients said they wanted was something that they could use at home. So they were resistant to things that they had to use in public, and they were particularly resistant to walking around with a tongue tip in their mouth in public. So they said, "Look, we're going to have to use this at home."
Yeah.
Now, as it turns out, our treatment regimen was being informed by a growing body of literature and research across a number of universities across the world. So it turns out that 30 to 60 minutes per day was what was emerging as the kind of ideal treatment session time, which I guess was enough to drive therapeutic effects, but not be such a burden on the patient that they would that your compliance rates would fall off. So in the Tente 1 study, for example, patients came in. They were fitted with the device, they went home, they used it for 6 weeks, 30 to 60 minutes per day. They came back in after 6 weeks. We had an interim assessment with them. On the device, we assessed compliance, so everything is all patient interactions with the device are monitored. Use embedded logging on the device, so we know if they have any interaction with it, they pick it up, press buttons. We even know if it's making good contact with the tongue. There's contact sensing on the tongue tip electrode. We know the level of stimulation being supplied on the tongue tip. So we tracked compliance very, very tightly. And what we saw was that compliance was extremely high in this trial. It was 83+%. And I mean, as I mentioned, Professor Berthold Guth is the PI on the German site. He has done multiple clinical trials in the field of tinnitus, and he said that the compliance rates that we're seeing in this study are very high compared to other trials. So that tells us a number of things, that the patients like the device, but also the patients who are experiencing benefit, or it gives you a kind of almost a kind of sanity check that patients are experiencing benefit, because if they weren't, they generally give up on treatment, and become non-compliant. So.
in terms of the way the device works, is it neuroplasticity based? Is it there's a lot of talk about bi-modal stimulation, about it's preparing the brain and then delivering a signal to the brain. Is it forcing the neuroplasticity in terms of your device?
Yeah, so I think the easiest way to explain it is to first explain the kind of mechanisms that we believe are underlying tinnitus, and then talk about how the device interacts with those.
Aye.
So I often we believe that tinnitus is, for the majority of cases, related, and while there's a causal link yet to be proved, we believe that it is related to hearing loss. And I often use the analogy of an electric water pump. So if you starve the supply of an electric water pump, right, if you bend the hose of the water going in, the pump will oscillate in a desperate attempt to try to suck in more water. And we believe the same thing is happening with tinnitus. When hearing loss occurs, the brain tries to fill that gap with noise. And we see this in hyperactivity in auditory brain stem structures like the cochlear nucleus, inferior colliculus, thalamus, and so you start to see that noise in the system following hearing loss. And we believe that noise is ripples up to the auditory cortex, where it's actually perceived as noise. So, and from there, actually, what happens is that the condition becomes habituated by forming a network with emotional and attentional centers that kind of feed off each other and habituate the problem. So we are using bi-modal neuromodulation to try disrupt and even reverse some of those neuropathologies. Yeah. So we know that bi-modal neuromodulation, when you combine auditory stimulation with trigeminal nerve stimulation, that it has inhibitory effects in some of these lower order structures. We know this from the work of Professor Hubert Lim, who recently joined us as our Chief Scientific Officer, other researchers, Professor Susan Shore in the University of Michigan. So we know that this bimodal stimulation has effects, and we know this from animal studies, which were invasive, and we looked at these structures and see the actual mechanistic effects. So our idea then is to combine those two forms of stimulation, and to and we also know that when you, as you said, when you pair sound with electrical stimulation again and again and again, it drives these neuroplastic processes, which lead to long-term effects. So we're trying to disrupt these neuropathologies, and then through repeated stimulation, then make sure that benefit is long-term by driving this process of neuroplasticity.
Is it designed to the actual individual's tinnitus, the sound they listen to? So
it's not. As I said, it's personalised to their hearing, to their hearing loss. We see, tinnitus as a stimulation problem. When we approached this from when we were working on it in the university, we looked at auditory stimulation alone, and we said, okay, especially in cases where there's greater levels of hearing loss, there's a fundamental kind of limitation to that therapy, because again, using the water pump analogy, if the supply is restricted due to hearing loss, there's only a certain amount of stimulation you're going to get through the ear, due to hearing loss. So we started looking at, okay, how else can we stimulate the system? Now, there was a growing body of literature, there were people like Bob Levine, Charlie Lieberman out of Harvard, and they were all pointing towards this this somatosensory side channel that innervated the auditory system, and in fact was acting as a kind of an inhibitory input into it. So we said, okay, let's try exploit that. Let's pair sound stimulation in these damaged hearing bands with this inhibitory trigeminal stimulation, and drive it again and again and again to disrupt these neuropathologies that are causing the tinnitus, and then drive long-term, if you like, hardwire that disruption into the brain through repeated stimulation.
Question that people have asked is around about tinnitus tone. So effectively the tone of the tinnitus, because a lot of people will report tinnitus tones that are above their actual hearing capabilities. So effectively, that tone is irrelevant to what you're doing, because it doesn't, where there are other audio treatments which say, well, if your tone's above, say, 10 kilohertz or 8 kilohertz, then we can't really effectively treat you. But yours is kind of more of a universal thing, if you like.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's the tonality, atonality, pitch of the tinnitus is not relevant to the therapy. Yeah.
All right, so again, with people with multiple tones, so
Exactly.
Whether they've got 1 or whether they've got 10, and again with the fluctuation, that wouldn't have an effect at all. If somebody had a fluctuating tone where they've got 1 tone one day, 1 tone another day, that wouldn't make a difference to the treatment.
Neither tonality nor laterality, centrality, they don't matter. As I said, we're approaching it from a stimulation perspective. It's about getting sufficient stimulation into these damaged bands, because the brain is making up the loss of sensory input, filling it with noise. So we're trying to get more sensory input in there. The brain cannot live in a sensory vacuum. It abhors, this is the reason, and I think it was Roland Shatta in London showed that if you use earbuds and kind of hearing protectors, and you deprive the sense of hearing for a period of time, I think it was weeks or months, that you can actually induce tinnitus.
Yeah.
So that kind of shows that kind of central gain phenomenon. So we approached this initially from that kind of perspective. So we're independent, or we don't really care what the actual perceptual manifest is, or the tone of it, if you like.
How does it actually help the tinnitus? What were your sort of primary outcomes? Were you looking at loudness? Were you looking at bothersome? What have you measured a reduction in?
So in the TENT-A1 study, the 2 primary outcomes were THI and TFI. We also measured MML. And basically the patients, as I said, they were enrolled at the start of the study. We took their baseline scores in those outcome measures. Then they took the device home. They used it for 30 to 60 minutes per day for 12 weeks. We also saw them at the interim point, which was at the 6-week mark. We measured THI, TFI, we measured MML, and a number of other exploratory outcome measures as well. And what we looked at were the within arm changes. So the patients, when they came in, as I said, they were randomly allocated to one of 3 arms. Each arm got a different set of stimulation parameters. There was our preferred approach, which is this high frequency synchronized stimulation. There was another one that was high frequency asynchronous, that was looking at the effects of delays in certain subtypes. And then there was a third arm that was more orthogonal to our preferred approach, so it was low frequency asynchronous stimulation. And patients, all patients and researchers were fully blinded, so the study was completely blinded. So nobody knew what form of stimulation any of the patients were getting. At 12 weeks, they came back in, they handed in their device. We did the final assessment then. We followed up with patients 6 weeks, 6 months, and 12 months later to see, if they were retaining effects. So to determine the efficacy of the intervention, we compared baseline to final, and then we compared so that was within arm differences or changes. Then we looked between arms, so we wanted to see how these stimulation parameters performed relative to each other. And then thereafter, in the follow-up phase, 6 weeks, 6 months, 12 months, we wanted to see if those therapeutic benefits persisted in the longer run. But THI and TFI were the 2 primary outcome measures. MML was an exploratory, along with a number of others. So what we saw was that within arm, we saw statistically and clinically significant improvements in all outcome measures. And then what we saw was then in the longer term, so in the longer term follow-up over the 12 months, that high frequency synchronous stimulation outperforms low frequency asynchronous stimulation. So we saw a strong divergence between those 2 arms over the 12-month
So did they both have an initial positive effect?
They both had an initial positive effect, but then where they diverged was in the longer run.
So at the minute, obviously, limitation on time because of when you've done the trial. So 12 months data is what we've got at the minute. And are you going to be looking at returning to those patients over the course of time to measure them even longer term in the future?
So we don't have plans to follow up with the patients beyond 12 months. So the study, as I said, the protocol was designed, published in the British Medical Journal before the study, and the plan was measure treatment over 12 weeks and then follow up over 12 months. So that's what we've done. So
which is quite a long follow-up time.
It's I'm not aware of any other clinical trial that has done such a kind of a long-term follow-up phase.
Say, for example, you get a patient, it'll come to you, they'll do 3 months the device, and say they have an event a couple of years after they've used it. Are they able to come back and use the device again? Do you anticipate that it'll have the same effect on the patient? Because we'll have an anecdotal report in a patient who'll have an event, they'll go to a concert, they'll go to something, and the tinnitus will jump back up again. Is it something you envisage would be useful there? Would you put them through a 3-month trial, like a 3-month process again, or would it be a shorter process?
I guess we can't answer that right now. We can all we can say is what we have clinical evidence for. But if they have, and what we know right now is that if patients undergo 12 weeks of 30 to 60 minutes stimulation per day, the majority of these patients experience a 12-month benefit from that treatment. Now, what happens thereafter, we'll have to figure out later. If the patient has a flare-up later and has to undergo another treatment, we will probably follow the same treatment regime. And your other question was around whether it would be as effective again. We can't say. There's no reason why we believe it wouldn't be.
So in terms of the measured benefit, can you give like sort of percentage improvements? So I appreciate it. Have you published yet, or is it we're still awaiting the publication?
So what we are doing right now is we're disseminating the results. We're Professor Hubert Lim, who's our Chief Scientific Officer, Mr. Brendan Conlon, ENT, who's our Chief Medical Officer, also Berthold Languth, who's on our Science Advisory Board, Sven Van Est, who's on our Science Advisory Board. They have been presenting the results of the study at kind of high level or very prominent scientific and clinical meetings. The publication is in preparation and will be submitted for peer review in early 2019. How long that takes, so the peer review process can take, you can never say exactly how long it takes. It depends, what feedback the reviewers come back with, etc. It will be published. It will be open access. All of our papers are open access. They're available on our website and on publishers' websites under open access. So we always make sure that patients and everybody can get access to our both our results and our protocols. So right now we're just disseminating the results. You asked about in terms of percentage improvement. So percentages, I guess they can be a bit misleading. What I can say is that over 80% of patients reported some level of their tinnitus after 12 weeks of treatment. More than 2/3 experienced a clinically significant improvement in tinnitus. So if you look at it in terms of percentage, it's over 30% average improvement, but that includes responders and non-responders. If you just look at patients who respond to the treatment, that percentage would be higher. So there's a couple of caveats there when you talk about percentages.
So in terms of responders, do you have anything mapped out? Because you'll come across people who are non-responsive to audio. Is that a group who are going to be in your studies that have been non-responsive to the treatment?
So part of the treatment, as I said, was about kind of parameter optimization or stimulus optimization, but also patient subtyping. So we want to move towards more targeted, personalized treatment. We want to be able to clinically identify who is responsive to the patient, who's very responsive, and equally who's non-responsive. Like, we don't want to waste patients' time if they're not candidates for the treatment. So what we know at this time is that patients who have tinnitus and a concomitant hyperacusis are highly responsive to the treatment. The responder rates are over 90% in that group. The levels of response that they are getting are twice what the rest of people are getting. And thereafter, we know, so there's those group of kind of super responders, there's a group of, then there's the rest of the tinnitus population. Yeah. And we know that 2/3 of those patients get clinically significant benefit from using this high frequency synchronous stimulation.
Does the degree of hyperacusis matter in this case? Does it matter if they have it really bad or if they've got it mildly? Or?
So it does, interestingly enough. So we defined hyperacusis as patients who are sensitive to sound 60 dBSL or below. And as I said, we wanted, when we saw this group popped out or were very responsive, we wanted to be sure that we just didn't get lucky statistically. So what we did was then we included all the patients in arm 1, so all the patients that got high frequency synchronous stimulation, and we correlated their level of hyperacusis to the level of improvement that they registered after treatment. And it turns out there's a very strong correlation between the two. So the more hyperacoustic you are, the more responsive you are to this treatment, the more benefit you will get from it. So that's very, very exciting, because this group, they constitute about 20% of the overall tinnitus population, and equally they have been a group that have been difficult to treat, because audiologists have, when these patients come in, audiologists have predominantly sound-based therapies to offer them, and these patients are averse to sound. They're sensitive to it. So it's very exciting that we found this, that they're responsive, because, as I said, they've been a difficult group to manage clinically. So now there's a very strong evidence option for those patients. But equally, if they're not hyperacoustic patients, then their chances still of responding are still very high. 2/3 of patients achieve a clinically significant improvement after 12 weeks of treatment. And as I said, then the majority of patients seem to enjoy that benefit for up to 12 months after treatment has stopped.
I guess there's more work to do on the subtyping. Is that something that you're going to be able to get from the data that you've gathered in the trial by delving a little bit deeper into it? So, yeah. Are you looking at causation of tinnitus? I know we talked about the correlation between hearing loss and tinnitus being the primary thing, but are you looking at other causes where there could be multiple? I mean, for example, the somatic diagnosis, is that one of your key drivers as well, having the somatic diagnosis?
So our inclusion criteria for the TENTE-1 study was that there were patients who had essentially neurological or subjective tinnitus. So we ruled out things like what I call mechanical etiologies.
And pulsatile.
Pulsatile were out. If they had whiplash injuries, TMJ, things like that, those patients, we didn't include those patients because they have some kind of mechanical somatic component that may be driving the tinnitus, and they tend to be candidates for surgical treatments or other forms of treatment. So we wanted to look at these chronic tinnitus sufferers, patients that had tinnitus for 3 months to 5 years. So we looked at that was the time range we looked at in TENTE-1. In TENTE-2, which is another study that we followed up, I haven't mentioned, but we actually extended that. We're looking for 3 months to 10 years now.
So sorry, just to interrupt there. So that the actual duration of tinnitus in your studies, was that a factor? Was people less efficacy for if you've had tinnitus for longer? Or
so
did they?
we have, as you asked about kind of causes and things, duration, and we have an absolute ton of data right now, and we're working our way through that. And we continue to conduct exploratory analysis, so we will get more and more answers over time. In our initial look at it, duration doesn't seem to be a factor. You mentioned also then that we looked at, you asked about somatic tinnitus and stuff. again, we're still looking at that. But the subgroup that have emerged most strongly are these hyperacoustic patients. But we continue to explore this incredible amount of data that we have to see if anything comes out. Now, we're following TENT-A1 with a subsequent study, TENT-A2, which has 191 patients. So in total, they will be more than 500 patients. So there's 326 patients in TENT-A1, 191 in TENT-A2. So taken together, we will have this, a very large amount of data. So we hope to get a lot more information from that.
See a timeline on TENT-A2?
So TENT-A2 is underway. I won't discuss it today because you and I have discussed in the past about tinnitus talk can be problematic in that if patients are on a trial and they're talking about their experience on tinnitus talk, they may undermine blinding or so that's underway. Patients are moving from the final kind of treatment phase into follow-up now. But again, they're still blinded. They don't know which arm they're on, so we won't talk about that study much now.
So when's it due for completion?
So it's patients have now moved into follow-up, so that will be completed, I would say. We have to follow patients up for a year. So I don't actually have a date off the top of my head, but it'll be, I guess it'll be around 12 months from now.
Have you had any instances of people either becoming worse or people who've said they're actually cured of the tinnitus in the trials?
So we're obviously very cautious of the word cure. So it's a kind of a double-edged sword. The word, obviously, the organizations like the Tinnitus Research Initiative, their motto is together towards a cure. We are all working towards that, but we have to be kind of careful and responsible with terms like that. So what we can say is that we've had some patients who have had a very, very significant improvement. Anecdotally, they might say to you that their tinnitus is gone or has stayed away. But again, we need to be responsible in reporting those kind of anecdotal outcomes. But yes, some patients have had fairly life-changing experiences. Have patients gotten worse? There were a small number of patients who have gotten worse, not dramatically. Their tinnitus might have gotten, elevated. These patients, they were asked whether they wanted to discontinue the treatment or continue. A lot of them continued. Most of those cases then resolved. So we haven't had any serious adverse events on the study, and so we haven't had any very kind of. That's the term, serious adverse events, so there aren't any patients that we're very, very concerned about. And the majority of patients did actually, even patients and some patients experience some change at the start, which is probably to be expected, if you're doing something and you're disrupting these kind of neural processes, there is going to be change. You are going to notice changes. But over the kind of 12 weeks of treatment, the majority of patients improved. As I said, 80+% of patients who got high-frequency synchronous stimulation reported some level of improvement, and 2/3 of patients then achieved clinically significant improvement.
So in terms of safety profile, and effectively that it's proved.
Yeah, so this is our, we have done multiple clinical trials at this point. So we've proven again and again and again that the therapy is both safe and effective. So TAB's study was with 60 patients. That proved the initial safety and efficacy of the device. We've now repeated the safety and efficacy outcomes of TAVs in TENT-A1. We're now in TENT-A2 where we're seeing, okay, we have the initial kind of data from it, but we're seeing very similar things from that too. So it's we've repeated it again and again and again. The device is very, very safe in terms of And I'm particularly conscious that these hyperacusis patients who are so sensitive to sound, and they will be, they probably have a lot of anxiety about treatments that involve sound. So it's important to kind of say that the device is, both the headphones and the actual device itself have got inbuilt kind of safety measures to ensure that they can't go above safe levels of sound. In addition to that, then the device is calibrated for their hearing level. So it's very safe. There was some minor irritation of the tongue reported from the stimulus, but again, that usually resolved, or if patients stopped, for a short period, it resolved. So there were no long-term adverse effects of the treatment.
In terms of just thinking about the hearing profile of the individual, then, so you do actually have to have a certain level of hearing to qualify for the treatment?
Yes. So, I mean, if you are profoundly deaf, if you're a patient that, that's a cochlear implant candidate, then our device in its current format, well, you're not a candidate for it, because you have to have a certain level of hearing still available to stimulate the auditory system. The device could be used with cochlear implants in the future. We know that cochlear implant patients do suffer from tinnitus. We know that cochlear implants are very good at suppressing tinnitus when they're turned on, but unfortunately patients have to turn them off and take off the cochlear implant at night to go to sleep. And what we have heard anecdotally from a lot of cochlear implant patients is the tinnitus spikes at night, which is not great because it's the time they're trying to get to sleep. So in the future we would like to look at cochlear implant patients, and instead of having headphones as we have now, we'll pair the device with cochlear implants.
Thinking about the headphones again, so we've covered the safety side of it, because there are a lot of tinnitus patients who will say, well, actually, I don't want to be wearing headphones. I don't want to be wearing that, because there's a number of people who feel that that's possibly one of the things that's caused the tinnitus in the first place. So again, on the safety profile, you haven't had any issues with the patients?
No, again, there are very strong kind of safety directives in the European Union about the maximum level of sound stimulation these devices can administer. In addition to that, and I know that the British Tinnitus Association have pointed to that longer exposure periods of that, even safe levels, can potentially lead to hearing loss and tinnitus. But our treatment is 30 to 60 minutes per day. In the trial, we fairly strictly control that. So patients, could only do one treatment per day. The device is very safe, can't deliver dangerous levels of sound. The maximum it can set have been, regulated by the European Union. So it's a very safe device. In terms of the headphones, okay, right now our device has Bluetooth over-ear headphones. We'll see what happens in the future. Patients often say to us, well, could I use it with my own earbuds, or could I, patients have asked us, can they use it with their hearing aids, because their hearing aids are Bluetooth enabled. We're looking at that, but when you're doing a clinical trial, you have to do it in very kind of controlled, you have to control for all these different variables. So the technology definitely has to remain the same throughout the trial. You can't have that variability. So that's the current product format.
So would you end up having to actually run another trial on hearing aids or another trial on earbuds to get the efficacy for a different device?
Possibly. There are ways that if you have demonstrated efficacy initially using one technology, if you can prove another technology is technically equivalent, so that, for example, that hearing aids can deliver the same types of auditory stimulation that we used in the trial, then there are regulatory pathways open that you can get those devices approved, but they have to be technically equivalent. The pain of tinnitus is in different places for different patients. For some patients, they say, I can't sleep at night. So I'm trying to get a sleep at night, and I'm distracted during the day by noises, by talking to people. At night it's quiet and I can focus on my tinnitus and I can't get to sleep. For other patients, it's about concentration, or it might be that it's intrusive in that they can't interact with their loved ones or whatever. So it impacts, while the primary symptom is the same for all patients, it impacts in different aspects of their life. And that's one of the beauties about the THI and TFI. It looks at all those. It's kind of almost independent of where it's having an effect. It's kind of averages them all. So some of the patients report dramatic improvements in sleep. And we talked about, or one of the questions was about comorbidities. So sleep is, one of the ones that's included in the THI and TFI. And some of these patients, they talk about, I was down to 2 hours sleep at night. I was just passing out from pure exhaustion. And now I'm up to 8. They talk about having 12 hours sleep. I can't remember what that was like. Been
a while since I've been a student.
Yeah, exactly. But so that's so some of them are talking about pretty dramatic, but it's in different parts of their life. Other people talk about being, I'm less irate with the children. I can concentrate better at work. So it's that's again, as I said, what is so good about the THI and TFI. And that is why they are, and we looked at all the outcome measures that you could possibly use in every clinical trial. We basically did a systematic review of outcome measures, and we found that the THI was the most widely used, followed by the TFI, and then MML. But a lot of people reported difficulties with MML in that, as I said, it's difficult if you've got 2 types of tinnitus, which do you try mask, the laterality of it, all that kind of, so it's difficult. And if one form starts to come down, then, are you, what do you measure then? Do you measure the other part of it? It's challenging.
In the trials again, because we often talk about the sort of severe group, the 1 to 2%, as you recall.
Yeah.
Did that in the trials? Did you have representation from that group?
No. So one of the inclusion criteria, one of the exclusion criteria was we removed or we excluded people that were at the floor and the ceiling, if you like. So the people at the floor, they've nowhere to go. They can't improve, right? If you've got less than 10 points on THI, I mean, and we do have people turning up to the clinical trial with very, very low scores of THI. But as I said, so they have no capacity to improve. So we want to look at the patients who have room to move one way or the other. We also, for the same kind of reason, we look at we don't include the top kind of percentile of patients, because we want to, as you asked about, did some patients get worse or better? You want to see as a group, do they get worse or get better? Now, if they don't have the capacity to get worse or get better, then it's a problem. So you take out both of those ends. Also, the really top patients, the patients who are scoring really, really high on THI and TFI, tend to have a lot of complex comorbidities. And they tend to be kind of intertwined, so they can suffer from depression, anxiety, a lot of issues. A lot of them tend to be medicated or using some levels of medication. So how do you tell that it's your intervention having the effect and not maybe some change in their medication? So that's the reason you exclude both of those groups. So what we can say is that, again, we can only say what we've proven, and what we've proven is, in the TENTE study, is that patients, from, the kind of the moderate up to kind of, below severe, we'll say, below catastrophic, those patients, if they undergo 12 weeks of 30 to 60 minutes per day treatment, they have, an average improvement that's kind of double the published minimal clinically important difference, and that seems to persist 12 months after treatment.
Yeah. Are you able to actually see how it works? Have you got any brain imaging data or anything like that?
So it's difficult to see how these things work in humans.
Yeah.
What we know is there's lots of animal data that shows that bi-modal neuromodulation has demonstrated the effects in the brain of animals. So both Professor Hubert Lim, when he was working in the University of Minnesota before he joined us, Professor Susan Shore, who's working at the University of Michigan. So they have lots of studies, and other researchers as well, have lots of studies that show the effects of bi-modal neuromodulation in the brain. So, but those studies are invasive. So we can't conduct those studies on humans, but they allow us to see in kind of great detail what's going on mechanistically. Now we infer that the same thing is happening in the human brain as what's happening in the animal brain. So then when we move over to humans, then as you alluded to, we've got brain imaging technologies. We've got MRI, we've got EEG, etc., ABRs. So, but they're not definitive either. We have to look at changes in brain signals and again infer what might be happening underneath from those change in brain signals. So they don't give us a definitive picture, and there is yet, and this is kind of like one of these kind of golden egg that we're all kind of all want is this objective biomarker of tinnitus. An electrophysiological signal that we can say, yes, that is tinnitus. That has eluded us so far. People have different theories about different signals that might represent tinnitus or changes in the brain related to tinnitus, etc. But again, we don't have it. So we cannot see exactly what's happening. What we have is we can see what's happening in the brains of animals. We can infer what's happening in the brains of humans from that. We've got some brain imaging data that we can loosely probe. We can infer, insights from that. But for us, our view on it is to do large-scale clinical trials with hundreds of patients and measure the clinical outcomes of the treatment. It's like a person who worked in the pain field said to me, it's about how many people you get back to work. So we want to help patients to improve their sleep, their concentration, their irritability around their family members, wherever tinnitus is impacting their life. We want to improve that. So we've done large scale clinical trials with lots and lots of patients, over 500, including these latest two trials. And we're looking at the psychometric outcome measures that include all of those impact areas of tinnitus.
What's the science behind using the tongue? Why the tongue? Why not the temples? Why not the earlobe? But why the tongue?
So you can stimulate the trigeminal nerve in kind of anywhere in the face or neck. The reason we chose the tongue initially was that it is one of the most densely innervated parts of the body. The fingertip is the only other part that's as densely innervated. It also doesn't have the epidermal layer. So in terms of stimulating it, it's very easy. You can stimulate with very low levels of energy. It's very safe. It also has, luckily enough, has its own electrically conducting electrolyte, which is saliva, and it's replenishing all the time. So it's just an ideal site to stimulate. But Hubert Lim, and now this is when he was working independently of our company. There were three groups, as I said, kind of working on similar technologies. There was us, there was Hubert Lim, and there was Professor Susan Shore. And Hubert published a paper in Nature Scientific Reports where he looked at different stimulation sites, and he identified that the tongue was actually the best place to stimulate. So we had chosen it for engineering reasons, and we also for neurological reasons. But then he confirmed in these animal studies, where, as I said, you can see in very fine detail exactly what's happening in the brain.
with using the tongue, I mean, is there, we have touched on the safety profile, but is there any risk of damage to the tongue, to the receptors on the tongue through the treatment?
So again, we've done multiple clinical trials now, and we've looked at safety in all those trials. So we've got, we're pushing on 600-700 patients now, so that we have safety data from. So all these patients have used the device 30 to 60 minutes per day for 12 weeks. So what we're seeing is that in a small number of cases, there can be minor irritation to the tongue. But if the patient discontinues treatment for a short period of time, that usually resolves. We have not seen any long-term deleterious effects of tongue stimulation.
Why did he use audio rather than another form of stimulation in particular?
So again, we approached it from that tinnitus was arising from hearing loss, and it was a stimulation of the auditory system problem, if you like. So again, loss of input through the ear leads to hyperactivity in the auditory brainstem that ripples up to the auditory cortex where it's perceived as sound. So we wanted to stimulate. We want to stimulate the auditory system. So we're looking at supplementing the auditory stimulation with somatosensory stimulation. There are papers, again, Hubert Lim, other people have shown that if you stimulate the somatosensory system alone, the trigeminal system, you can stimulate the auditory system, but it actually has adverse effects on the auditory system. So somatosensory stimulation alone is probably not advisable, or that's at least that's what some of the science is showing us.
Have you gathered any data on children at all, or was it all adult population?
So our clinical trials only included patients over 18, so we have no data for children. So it's not the device is not currently indicated for children.
In terms of release of the treatment, appreciate there's certain things we can and we can't cover on this, but I'll ask the questions anyway.
Yeah.
When is the schedule released? Where you're looking at Ireland first?
Yeah, so we have, as I said, we have CE marking, which allows us to market the product in Europe. Yeah. We've had that since 2014. So we are looking at initially, making the product available in 2019 in Ireland. Thereafter, we're looking at a number of other European countries and sites. And then in parallel, we are going to pursue FDA approval. So we have appointed a leading FDA expert, and now we're working towards getting FDA approval so we can launch it in the US. So it will be available in a limited capacity in 2019 in certain European sites, Ireland first, and then from there, then we'll make it more widely available both in Europe and in the US.
Are you able at the minute to say anything about the price point or not?
So the price point is to be determined. As I said, we literally, since 2015, we have focused, again, we're a small company, we have focused the limited resources of the organization exclusively on this pretty extensive clinical research program. It's one of the largest clinical research programs that have been conducted in tinnitus, by patient numbers, by investment, by all standards, and we've been really focusing on that. Being very sure that the device is effective, finding out who who are suitable candidates, who we are trying to identify who are not suitable candidates. Unfortunately, that's not emerging as a clear picture right now, but we'll continue to work on that in the exploratory data. So up to now, we've been focusing on that kind of clinical activity, and now we're starting to move on to commercial activity. So things like pricing, availability, we don't have that much information on that at this point.
For somebody to use the device, it would be fitted by an audiologist?
Yes, so the device, as I said, requires an audiogram. So generally, either an audiologist or as in some cases an audiometrist can carry out a pure tone audiometry test. We envisage that the device will be personalised or tuned and fitted by a clinical audiologist, and in the longer term we'll see what happens, but that's the plan right now.
So are you training audiologists, or is it the process of actually fitting the device, is that going to become via training from the company?
Again, as I said, we had audiologists as on staff and ENT doctors on staff from the very start of the company, from the very start of when we started to develop the technology. And as I said, we took their input to ensure that the device, because one of the common complaints we heard from the clinical people who managed tinnitus was, about different technologies to come to market, was the burden that they had on these already very busy healthcare providers. So if you go to an audiology clinic or an ENT clinic in any public hospital in Ireland, certainly, and it's probably the same in the UK, but they're extremely busy. It's about just getting the patients through. So if you have some device that's going to make that consultation longer or more involved, that's a burden on the healthcare system, and therefore the doctors are not going to be as motivated to utilize that treatment. So our device, it only requires, as I said, we're coming at it from a stimulation perspective, so it actually only requires a pure tone audiometry test, and then setting the actual levels of stimulation on the device are very, very easy. So it doesn't pose a significant burden on the healthcare provider or on the patient. So we tried to make sure that it was kind of suitable or attractive to all kind of stakeholders.
One thing that people from different countries are quite interested in is, could they access it from their country? Potentially, if they were to get the audiology test, get their audiogram, could they then potentially purchase the device, say from Ireland or say from the UK, wherever it launches next?
So patients will have to physically see their audiologist to get the device. We're not going to. Well, we don't have approval to sell into the US. So we have European approval. They have to physically see their audiologist to get the hearing test, and they really patients need to be under the care of a healthcare clinician, right? So they have to see the patient to get, but also then the longer term, they need to be able to talk to her if they have any concerns or if there are any issues. If their tinnitus fluctuates or if they get irritation of the tongue, they need to be under the care of a doctor. So, and ideally, if they're, in another country, it's not the ideal scenario. But I guess that's, we have regulatory approval for all of Europe. Patients do travel for treatments, but what we would say the responsible kind of thing is that they have to be under the care of an audiologist. We will work to get the device in patients' hands as quickly as possible. We have worked long and hard to develop this technology, to prove the clinical efficacy of the safety, all this kind of stuff. So we have spent a lot of time on this, and we haven't dedicated a huge portion of our lives so that this can't get into the hands of patients. We're motivated by the problem. We want to solve this problem, and so we're going to work to get it into the hands of patients in every market we can in the shortest time possible.
Touching on FDA approval, do you have a timeline? Because obviously it's a large market, it's around about 50% of the people who visit our site from the US. So do you have any sort of timeline on the FDA approval yet?
So our target, again, it's a bit like the peer review process. You don't know. There's a certain amount of variability in it. It depends how much information they want. Bi-modal neuromodulation for tinnitus is completely unique. There is no other treatment on the market for. We are the first bi-modal neuromodulation treatment on the market for tinnitus. So it's when you have a technology that is a step change from anything that's come before, the regulators tend to be cautious. They're going to go, okay, we haven't dealt with this kind of technology. We're very comfortable with sound therapies. There are lots of those, but this is something completely new. So we can't say exactly how long it is, but we would aim to have FDA approval in 2019, within calendar year 2019.
Are you looking at availability on healthcare and insurance?
Yeah, so we want our technology to be accessible to patients. We haven't, worked this hard to make the thing available for it not to be accessible to patients. So we are looking at reimbursement. That varies from market to market, so we'll have to look at it in each case. But we believe there's a very strong argument for our product to be reimbursed. If you look at the experience of most tinnitus patients, they'll have seen their ENT doctor at least twice. The British Tinnitus Association did an excellent piece of research recently that showed that many patients have seen their ENT or a second ENT twice in 1 year. And that's because these patients are not being adequately treated or managed. So they're obviously frustrated enough to go back to their family doctor, get a second referral, go to the ENT to see if there are any other options that are available. So it's a very, very frustrating experience for patients. But it's also a frustrating experience for the doctors, and there's a cost to the healthcare system as well. The doctors, I heard an anecdote, a patient saying that his ENT saying, "I'm not sure why you're here again because I can't offer you anything different or give you any different information." So that's very, very frustrating to both doctors and patients. And as I said, there's a cost to the healthcare system of them having been in the hospital twice. So we believe that our 10-day 1 data, which is very positive, both in terms of the level of improvement, but also the long-term effects, that if patients use our treatment, they may get that kind of long-term benefit. That means they don't have to go back to the doctor a second time. They don't have to go into the ENT. And that is better for the patient. It's better for the doctor. The doctor can then move on to seeing new tinnitus patients. And it's also, there's a cost saving to the healthcare system. Now, all of that taken together, there has to be a very strong case that for reimbursement there. So these patients, we are arguing that from the patient perspective, from the doctor perspective, and also from the wider healthcare system perspective, there's kind of a very strong argument that the product should be reimbursed.
Looking at the actual device, and outside of the tongue stimulation, could it potentially be delivered on a smartphone?
So the intervention or the treatment requires auditory stimulation and tongue stimulation. So in terms of it would have to have those components. So the smartphone could potentially replace the controller device. Right now are both the tones that the patient hears and the stimuli that the patient feels on their tongue, they're generated and controlled using this controller. That could potentially become a smartphone in the longer term. Right now, the product format is what it is. It has a controller, wireless headphones, and then a wired tongue tip. But in the longer term, who knows what will happen.
We've got a few people asking questions on the financials as well. Firstly, are you accepting investors? Now, I don't know how much money they've got, by the way, whoever asked this. So.
Okay. Well, the company was initially funded by the founders ourselves, the friends and family that we roped into giving us some money to help us bring the technology along, from a number of successful businessmen who suffered from tinnitus and were frustrated that there weren't more treatment options available for them, and they heard about our work in the university and they wanted us to bring this technology to market. But that was kind of early in our story. Since 2015, we have been funded through institutional investors. So they're the kind of investors that you need to talk to fund these large-scale clinical research programs. The kind of program that we're running with Tente 1 and Tente 2, which has hundreds of patients, that kind of research does not come cheap. So unfortunately, you need to talk to the kind of investors that have the firepower to fund that kind of work.
Somebody did ask this, which I will say. Any financial relation to tinnitus talk? I can answer that, but I'll let you.
No, there's. I'm not aware of any financial relationship right now between Neuromod.
We'll talk about it
talk.
afterwards. What about the marketplace at the minute? How competitive do you view the marketplace? We know there's not very much for tinnitus around currently.
Yeah, so we see the market as fragmented. And what we wanted to do was come to the market from a position of strength and credibility in terms of belief in the efficacy of our intervention. So we did that venture capital deal to invest in large scale rigorous clinical data. We're working with all the top scientists in the space, Professors Berthold Languth, Deborah Hall, Sven Venest, Rich Tyler from Iowa more recently, and Hubert Lim. So we're pulling together all the top people. We're putting together a really rigorous clinical research program to really try and move the field forward. Move not only the understanding of our intervention and how it works, but also how tinnitus more generally works. So we're seeing some very interesting things that are synergistic with what the TRI are finding. So the TRI, we're an organisation, again backed by philanthropic investment. So they have conducted very large scale research that's moving towards this subtyping, personalised treatments, and so we're seeing a lot of some of our research is probably in the same order of magnitude of what they're doing. So we're seeing a lot of we're finding a lot of things that complement each other's kind of research, but we believe that's what it's going to take to move the field of tinnitus forward. Is a lot of investment, a lot of great researchers working together, and to quote the TRI, working together towards, if not a cure, definitely very well evidenced and very effective treatments.
So who do you see as your competition at the moment in the marketplace?
So right now, the only actually clinically recommended treatment is CBT. A lot of clinicians will use auditory stimulation, either using hearing aids or hearing aids that have tinnitus components. So again, there's some fragmented kind of early stage technologies, but I don't think anyone has invested in the level of clinical evidence that we have. We've invested a significant amount of money. We've done very large scale clinical trials. We've done very long follow up, so that we can stand over our claims with great confidence and hopefully credibility.
So it's quite interesting. There's kind of a combination of different audio things, and it was quite, after using it for a little bit there, you could feel the sort of tinnitus blending down with it, where start off with it was actually above it, which is quite unusual because when I'm listening to things it often kind of jumps above it. So it kind of is like having popping candy on the tongue. So it's a really interesting sensation on the end of the tongue there, but very interesting. So I'd just like to say thank you very much for doing the Q&A. I think we've managed to cover everything that was asked on the forum.
Great, and look, we'd like to say thank you to you guys as well for the opportunity. We think you've done an amazing job with Tinnitus Talk. It's great to have a forum where patients can share their experiences, and there's a huge problem around tinnitus in general. It's just about awareness, knowledge, education. So I think you guys are doing a fantastic job in kind of helping raise awareness, understanding, but also kind of mutual support between the patients for each other. So that's and we welcome the opportunity to engage with you guys and to help educate patients, I guess, about what we're doing. So it's we're very excited about that.
Excellent, thank you.